The small town was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that made people feel safe. The streets were nearly empty, except for an elderly man walking slowly with a cane. His clothes were simple but clean, his face lined with years of wisdom and hardship. He moved carefully, his steps unsteady but determined. The man had lived in this town his whole life, but tonight, he would face something he never expected. 2 police officers patrolled the area, bored and looking for something to do. They spotted the old man and exchanged glances. To them, he looked out of place, maybe suspicious. Without thinking, they decided to stop him. The officers stepped out of their car, their boots hitting the pavement loudly. The old man paused, turning to face them with tired but calm eyes. "Evening, sir," the first officer said, though his tone wasn't friendly. "Where are you headed this late?" The old man blinked, surprised by the question. He had done nothing wrong, but the way they looked at him made him uneasy. "Just going home," he replied softly. The second officer smirked. "Home, huh? You sure about that?" They didn't believe him. The old man sighed. He knew this kind of treatment wasn't right, but he didn't argue. He had seen enough in his life to know when to stay quiet. The officers, however, weren't done. They asked for his ID, their voices growing sharper. The old man reached into his pocket slowly, not wanting to startle them. But one officer grabbed his arm roughly. "Move faster," he snapped. The old man winced but didn't complain. He handed over his ID, his hands trembling slightly. The officers examined it, whispering to each other. They didn't see a harmless old man, they saw someone they could push around. Little did they know, this quiet, humble man had a secret. A secret that would change everything. The officers led the old man to their patrol car, their grip firm on his thin arm. He didn't resist, but his heart ached. He had always respected the law, always believed in justice. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for no reason. The back seat of the car was cold and hard, and the old man sat quietly, his cane resting beside him. One of the officers chuckled as he got into the driver's seat. "Bet you didn't think your night would end like this, old-timer," he said, glancing back. The old man didn't answer. He just stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. He wondered what his son would say if he saw this. His son, the one person who had always stood up for him, no matter what. At the station, things didn't get better. The officers made him wait in a small room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They didn't offer him water or ask if he needed anything. Instead, they joked outside the door, their laughter loud and mocking. The old man closed his eyes, praying for patience. He knew his son would be worried if he didn't come home soon. Meanwhile, across town, a phone rang in a quiet, well-furnished office. A man in a sharp suit picked it up, his voice calm but authoritative. It was the old man's son, the most powerful judge in the city. When he heard the news, his expression darkened. His father, kind, gentle, and law-abiding, was being held for no reason. The judge stood up, his jaw set. He had always fought for justice, but tonight, it was personal. The back seat of the police car was cold and hard, the kind of uncomfortable that seeped into bones. The old man adjusted himself carefully, his joints protesting against the stiff plastic seats. His cane rested beside him, a simple wooden thing worn smooth from years of use. The officers up front muttered to each other, their voices low but carrying an edge of amusement. They thought this was funny. The old man stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. He knew every corner of this town, the bakery that always gave him a free loaf on Sundays, the barber who still charged him half price even though he could afford full, the park bench where he fed pigeons every morning. This was his home. And yet, tonight, he felt like a stranger in it. One of the officers glanced back at him through the rearview mirror. "You got any family, old man?" he asked, not out of kindness, but curiosity. The old man hesitated. He did have family, a son, in fact. But he didn't like to brag. Yes, he answered simply. The officer smirked. Bet they'll be real proud when they hear about this. The old man didn't respond. He knew his son wouldn't be proud, he'd be furious. But not at him. At the men who were treating him like this. The police station was brightly lit, the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything look stark and unwelcoming. The old man was led inside, his steps slow but steady. The officers didn't offer to help him walk, even when he stumbled slightly on the steps. Instead, they exchanged smirks, as if his struggle was part of the entertainment. Inside, the station buzzed with low activity. A few officers sat at desks, typing lazily or sipping coffee. One looked up as the old man was brought in, raising an eyebrow. "What's this?" he asked. "Picked him up wandering around near the old warehouses," one of the arresting officers said, shrugging. "Acted suspicious." The old man wanted to protest. He hadn't been near any warehouses. He'd been on Main Street, walking home from the grocery store. But he stayed quiet. Arguing wouldn't help. They sat him down in a small, windowless room, the kind they used for questioning. The chair was hard, the table bolted to the floor. One of the officers tossed a clipboard in front of him. "Fill that out," he said, before walking out and shutting the door behind him. The old man sighed. He reached into his pocket for his reading glasses, his fingers shaking slightly. He wasn't afraid, not really. Just tired. Tired of being treated like a problem when he had spent his whole life being anything but. Meanwhile, across town, in a quiet home office, a phone rang. The judge was working late, as he often did. Papers were spread across his desk, case files that needed reviewing before the morning. He rubbed his eyes, then picked up the phone without looking. "Yes?" The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Sir, it's about your father." The judge's hand tightened around the receiver. "What about him?" "He's been detained. At the 4th precinct." For a moment, the judge didn't move. Then, slowly, he set the phone down. His face, usually so controlled, darkened with something dangerous. He stood, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. Back at the station, the old man was still sitting in that small room. The officers had come back once, taken his clipboard, then left again without a word. He wasn't sure how long he'd been there. An hour? 2? His back ached from the chair, and he shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. Outside the door, he could hear voices. Laughter. Then, suddenly, silence. The door swung open. One of the officers who had arrested him stood there, but his smirk was gone. His face was pale. Behind him stood another man, taller, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable. The old man's eyes lit up. "Son," he said softly. The judge stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over his father, the way he was sitting, the tired slump of his shoulders, the cane resting against the table. Then he turned to the officer. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. Too quiet. "Explain." The officer swallowed. "Sir, we had reason to believe he was walking," the judge interrupted. "Is walking now a crime?" The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to his father, his voice softening. "Let's go home." The old man nodded, standing slowly. The judge took his arm, steadying him in a way the officers hadn't bothered to do. As they walked out of the room, the officers didn't meet their eyes. The station was dead silent. The walk out of the police station felt longer than it should have. The old man leaned slightly on his son's arm, not because he needed the support, but because he could sense the quiet rage simmering beneath the judge's calm exterior. The officers they passed avoided looking at them, suddenly very interested in their desks or coffee cups. No one stopped them. No one dared. The cold night air hit them as they stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the stale warmth of the station. The judge's car, a sleek, dark sedan, was parked right out front, as if no one had even considered telling him to move it. The old man gave a small, tired smile. Even now, his son commanded respect without having to ask for it. The judge opened the passenger door for his father, helping him in before closing it gently. For a moment, he just stood there, one hand on the roof of the car, breathing slowly. Then he walked around to the driver's side and got in. The engine purred to life, but he didn't pull away immediately. Instead, he turned to the old man. "Did they hurt you?" The question was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. The old man shook his head. "No. Just treated me like I was nothing." The judge's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, finally, he put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. The ride home was silent at first. Streetlights flickered past, painting the inside of the car in brief flashes of orange and white. The old man watched the town go by, his town, and wondered how something so familiar could feel so different now. "They didn't even ask me any real questions," he said after a while. "Just assumed I was up to no good because I was old and walking slow." His son's jaw clenched. "They'll regret that." The old man sighed. "I don't want trouble." "It's not trouble," the judge replied, his voice firm. "It's justice." The old man glanced at him. His son had always been stubborn, even as a boy. Once he set his mind to something, there was no changing it. And right now, his mind was set. Back at the station, the officers who had made the arrest were still standing in the same spot, as if frozen. The rest of the precinct had slowly returned to its usual hum of activity, but no one approached them. It was like they'd been marked. One of them finally broke the silence. "We're screwed." The other officer ran a hand over his face. He didn't say anything. "Maybe he'll let it go." A bitter laugh. "You saw his face. He's not letting this go." They both knew who the judge was. Knew what he was capable of. Knew that he didn't make threats, he made examples. The first officer swallowed hard. "We should have just left the old man alone." The judge's house was a modest but well-kept home on the quieter side of town. He helped his father inside, settling him into his favorite armchair before moving to the kitchen to put the kettle on. The old man watched him, the familiar routine soothing some of the tension from the night. "You don't have to do this," the old man said as his son handed him a steaming cup of tea. The judge sat across from him, his own cup untouched. "Yes, I do. It was just a couple of bad cops. It's not worth your energy." His son met his gaze. "It's not just about them. It's about every person they've ever treated like this. Every person who didn't have a judge for a son to step in." The old man sighed. He knew his son was right. But that didn't make it any easier. The next morning, the judge arrived at the courthouse early. His staff noticed the change in him immediately. The usual calm, measured man was replaced by someone with a quiet, burning intensity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. By noon, word had spread. The officers from the night before had been summoned to the courthouse. No one knew why, exactly, but everyone had their guesses. The old man, sitting on his porch with his tea, heard the news from a neighbor. He closed his eyes for a moment, then took a slow sip. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. His son wouldn't let this stand. The courthouse steps were cold beneath the judge's polished shoes as he climbed them the next morning. Normally, he would nod at the security guards, exchange pleasantries with the clerks. Today, his silence spoke louder than any words. The usual morning chatter died down as he passed through the metal detectors, employees suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Up in his chambers, he didn't bother with the usual stack of case files. Instead, he pulled two specific folders from his desk drawer, both containing complaints about police misconduct that had been quietly buried over the years. The names of the officers from last night were written on sticky notes attached to certain pages. His fingers traced the dates as he read through them again. 3 separate excessive force complaints, he murmured to the empty room. All dismissed. Down at the precinct, the 2 officers sat in the captain's office, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. The captain, a grizzled man with 25 years on the force, paced behind his desk, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "You stopped who?" he demanded for the 3rd time. The younger officer swallowed hard. "We didn't know it was his father, Captain." The old man was just dash. "Just what?" The captain's fist came down on his desk hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. "Walking while old? Is that a crime now?" Across town, the elderly man sat at his small kitchen table, stirring sugar into his tea with methodical precision. His hand still shook slightly from the night before, though he'd never admit it. The morning newspaper lay unread beside him, he couldn't focus on the words. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smirk on that officer's face when they'd shoved him into the patrol car. A knock at the door startled him. Through the frosted glass, he could make out the outline of a police uniform. His breath caught for just a moment before he recognized the familiar stoop of Sergeant Wilkins' shoulders, his neighbor from 3 doors down who'd been on the force for nearly 30 years. "Thought you might need some company," Wilkins said when the door opened, holding up a bag of still warm bagels. His kind eyes took in the old man's tired face. "Heard what happened?" Inside, over steaming cups of coffee, Wilkins listened without interrupting as the old man recounted the previous night's events. The sergeant's weathered hands clenched around his mug when he heard about the rough handling, about the mocking comments. "Those boys," Wilkins sighed, shaking his head. "They came on the job after I retired. All swagger and no sense." He reached across the table to pat his friend's arm. "Your boy's gonna do right by you. Always does." Back at the courthouse, the judge was doing exactly that. He'd summoned the police chief and the district attorney to an emergency meeting. The atmosphere in the conference room could have frozen water. "I want their badges," the judge said calmly, sliding the files across the polished table. "And I want every case they've touched in the last 2 years reviewed." The police chief opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it when he saw the names highlighted in the reports. These weren't first-time offenders, just officers who'd never faced real consequences. The district attorney, a shrewd woman who'd worked with the judge for a decade, nodded slowly as she reviewed the documents. "We'll need sworn statements," she said. "From your father, and any other witnesses." "They'll be here by noon," the judge replied. His phone buzzed, a text from his father's neighbor about the visit from Sergeant Wilkins. Some of the tension left his shoulders knowing his father wasn't alone. Meanwhile, the 2 officers sat in the precinct's break room, ignoring the stares from their colleagues. The younger one kept checking his phone, as if expecting some miraculous reprieve. The older one just stared at his coffee, replaying every mistake that had led them here. "You think he'll really go after our jobs?" the younger officer finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. His partner didn't answer right away. When he did, it wasn't what the younger man wanted to hear. "He's not just going after our jobs," he said quietly. "He's going to make sure we never work in law enforcement again. Anywhere." The words hung between them as the precinct phone rang. The desk sergeant answered, then turned to look directly at them. "Chief wants you both in his office. Now." At that same moment, the elderly man was pulling on his good jacket with Sergeant Wilkins' help. "You sure you're up for this?" Wilkins asked, adjusting the collar for his friend. The old man nodded, straightening his shoulders. If my son's fighting for me, least I can do is stand with him. As they stepped out into the sunlight, a courthouse van pulled up to the curb. The judge had sent it himself, complete with a respectful young officer to help them up the steps when they arrived. The message was clear: this was how you treated people. This was what respect looked like. The two disgraced officers would learn that lesson soon enough. The hard way. The courthouse corridors had never felt so long. The elderly man walked slowly, one hand on Sergeant Wilkins' arm, the other gripping his cane. Each step echoed against the marble floors, mixing with the distant murmur of voices from courtrooms. The young officer who'd driven them hovered respectfully a few paces behind, ready to assist but careful not to crowd the old man's dignity. They passed a bulletin board plastered with notices: community meetings, missing pet flyers, a faded poster about neighborhood watch. The old man's eyes lingered on a photocopied sheet listing citizens' rights when interacting with police. His mouth tightened. If only those officers had remembered their duties as well as citizens were expected to know their rights. Around the corner, the judge stood waiting outside a conference room, his posture rigid. When he saw his father, something in his face softened. He met them halfway, taking the old man's hands in his own. "You didn't have to come," he murmured. The old man squeezed his son's fingers. They felt warm, alive, so different from the cold metal of the handcuffs they tried to put on him. "Yes, I did." Behind them, the elevator dinged. The two officers stepped out, now in civilian clothes, no badges, no uniforms. The younger one's face went pale when he saw the judge. The older officer's eyes dropped to the floor immediately, but not before everyone saw the shame there. The judge didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he guided his father toward the conference room where the police chief and district attorney waited. But the old man paused, turning slightly to look at the officers. Not with anger, with something sadder, heavier. The kind of disappointment that settles in bones. The officers flinched under that gaze more than they ever had from the judge's fury. Inside the conference room, sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in the air. The district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, had arranged files in precise stacks. The police chief sat stiffly beside her, his hat placed carefully on the table, the brim perfectly parallel to the edge. When the old man entered, both officials stood immediately. The chief opened his mouth, but the judge raised one hand. "Let's hear my father's account first." Uninterrupted. And so the old man spoke. In simple words, with occasional pauses to find the right phrase, he described walking home with groceries, the sudden flashing lights, the way the younger officer had grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises now blooming purple beneath his sleeve. He mentioned the mocking laughter in the patrol car, the cold interrogation room chair that had made his arthritis flare up. When he got to the part where they'd asked if he had family, his voice wavered for the first time. "I said yes." They laughed. The police chief's face turned stony. The district attorney's pen hovered over her legal pad, leaving an ink blot where she'd pressed too hard. Sergeant Wilkins, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. "I've known this man 40 years, he said quietly. "He taught Sunday school when my kids were young. Helped start the neighborhood food bank. And those boys treated him like some back-alley criminal." The judge placed a hand on his father's shoulder. The warmth there steadied them both. Outside in the hallway, the two officers waited on a wooden bench, the younger one bouncing his knee nervously. They could hear muffled voices through the door but couldn't make out words. Every time someone walked past, a lawyer with an armful of files, a janitor pushing a cleaning cart, they hunched their shoulders as if expecting to be recognized, called out. The older officer suddenly spoke, barely above a whisper. "My dad was a cop. Taught me this job was about protecting people like that old man." He rubbed his face roughly. "When did we forget that?" The younger officer didn't answer. He was too busy watching a group of reporters gathering near the courthouse entrance, alerted by some unseen signal. News traveled fast in this town, especially when it involved the judge. Back in the conference room, the district attorney closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "We have enough for termination proceedings immediately. As for criminal charges..." She looked to the judge. The old man surprised everyone by speaking up. "I don't want them jailed." All eyes turned to him. Even his son looked startled. The old man adjusted his glasses slowly, taking time to choose his words. "I want them to understand. Really understand." He looked at the police chief. "Make them do community service at the senior center. Have them help people like me carry groceries, fix leaky faucets, change light bulbs we can't reach." The chief blinked. "That's unusually lenient." "It's not leniency," the old man corrected gently. "It's education." The judge studied his father's face, the deep wrinkles around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw that he himself had inherited, and nodded slowly. He turned to the officials. "We'll add mandatory sensitivity training. And they'll submit written apologies to every complainant in their files." The district attorney arched an eyebrow but made a note. The police chief actually looked relieved. Sergeant Wilkins hid a smile behind his coffee cup. When the officers were called in, they entered like men walking to the gallows. The younger one's hands shook visibly until he clasped them behind his back. The police chief stood, his voice formal. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony, we've reached a decision regarding your conduct. As the terms were laid out, the immediate dismissals, the community service hours, the public apologies, the officers' reactions couldn't have been more different." The younger one slumped in visible relief at avoiding jail time. The older one stood straighter, his eyes suspiciously bright when he heard the senior center assignment. The judge finally addressed them directly. "My father requested mercy when he had every right to demand punishment. Remember that when you're helping him carry his groceries next week." The older officer surprised everyone then by stepping forward. He didn't make excuses. Didn't beg for his job back. He simply looked the old man in the eye and said, "Thank you. I won't waste this." It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. As they left the courthouse hours later, the old man paused on the steps, breathing in the fresh air. Reporters shouted questions, but the judge shielded his father, guiding him gently toward their waiting car. Sergeant Wilkins clapped a hand on the old man's shoulder. "Still think you're too old to make trouble?" For the first time since the arrest, the old man laughed, a warm, rich sound that made a few bystanders smile without knowing why. His son's grip on his arm tightened affectionately. Somewhere across town, two former officers sat in a dingy diner, staring at coffee they couldn't afford, beginning to understand the true cost of their actions. And in the morning's paper, right beside the article about the disciplinary action, would be a small notice about the judge volunteering to teach a free legal clinic at the senior center. The message was clear: this town took care of its own. The senior center's community room smelled of lemon polish and the faintest hint of lavender from the sachets volunteers tucked into linen closets. Morning sunlight streamed through sheer curtains, illuminating dust particles that floated like lazy fireflies. The old man arrived early, as he always did on Tuesdays, to set up the chessboards before the others arrived. Today was different. Today, he wasn't alone. The two former officers stood awkwardly near the door, dressed in identical Navy volunteer vests that looked as uncomfortable as their expressions. The younger one, now sporting a growing beard since losing his clean-shaven police look, fidgeted with the hem of his vest. The older one stood stiffly, eyes fixed on the checkerboard floor tiles. "Clocks go on this side," the old man said without looking up as he arranged pieces on a chessboard. His hands, gnarled with arthritis but still precise, placed each piece exactly centered on its square. The older officer stepped forward first. "Where would you like me to?" "Not for me." The old man nodded toward the kitchen where clattering pans signaled breakfast preparation. Mrs. Kowalski's oatmeal will burn if someone doesn't stir it. She forgets. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the older officer squared his shoulders and walked toward the kitchen without another word. The younger officer remained, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I could, maybe help you with those? He gestured vaguely at the stack of chess boxes. The old man studied him for a long moment before sliding a box across the table. Set up the blue board. Queens on their own color. As the younger man fumbled with pieces, the old man watched with quiet amusement. Never played? Not exactly. A pawn slipped from his fingers, rolling under a chair. The old man retrieved it with a grunt, his knees popping audibly. This was my son's first game. 5 years old, he beat me in 7 moves. A rare smile creased his face at the memory. Knew right then he'd be a judge. The younger officer froze, the chess piece in his hand suddenly weighing far more than ivory. Across town at the courthouse, the judge was reviewing case files when his clerk knocked. Sir? The police chief is here. The chief entered holding 2 manila folders, the officer's personnel files now stamped terminated in angry red ink. Thought you'd want to see these yourself. The judge leafed through pages detailing complaints that had previously been ignored, a shoved teenager here, a racially charged remark there. Small abuses of power that had snowballed into what happened to his father. Your dad's solution was creative, the chief admitted, rubbing his neck. But the union's already screaming about precedent. The judge closed the files with deliberate calm. Good. Back at the senior center, the older officer was learning 3 important things. Mrs. Kowalski's oatmeal required constant stirring. She had an eagle eye for lazy stirring. She wasn't shy about pointing it out. Like this, young man, she instructed, grabbing his wrist to demonstrate proper circular motions. Her grip, surprisingly strong for someone who needed a walker, guided him. None of that lazy back-and-forth business. By the 3rd batch, he'd developed a rhythm. By the 5th, Mrs. Kowalski actually nodded approval. You might survive yet, she declared before shuffling off to supervise toast distribution. Through the serving window, he watched the old man patiently explaining chess moves to his former partner. The younger officer's forehead was creased in concentration, his usual swagger replaced by genuine focus. A strange feeling settled in the older officer's chest, something between shame and the first stirrings of pride in doing something actually useful. At lunchtime, the old man found himself flanked by both former officers as they helped residents with meal trays. The younger one nearly dropped a plate before catching it spectacularly, earning applause from a table of white-haired ladies who now called him Grace, much to his chagrin. You're enjoying this, the older officer murmured as they refilled lemonade pitchers. The old man didn't deny it. My son says justice should be restorative, not just punitive. He handed over a pitcher. That means. I know what it means, the older officer said quietly. Then, after a beat, thank you. Meanwhile, the younger officer was being schooled at checkers by a 94-year-old Korean War veteran who'd trapped his last piece in a triple jump. How's that ego feeling now, hotshot? The veteran crowed as the officer groaned good-naturedly. Across the room, the old man watched the interactions with quiet satisfaction. This was better than any courtroom victory, watching these proud men learn humility through service, seeing residents who'd once feared police badges now teasing their former oppressors. When the judge arrived unannounced during afternoon bingo, he paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, his father laughing at something the older officer said, the younger one carefully adjusting a walker for Mrs. Kowalski, the easy camaraderie that had somehow blossomed in just a few hours. Told you it would work, the old man said when he noticed his son. The judge's usually stern expression softened. You always were smarter than me. As bingo numbers were called and the former officers helped residents daub cards, something unexpected happened. The younger officer caught himself actually enjoying the work. The older one found himself remembering why he'd wanted to serve the public in the first place. And the old man? He sipped his tea, surrounded by friends old and new, content in knowing some wounds could heal if given the chance. The senior center's wall clock ticked toward 3 p.m., its rhythmic clicking nearly drowned out by the excited chatter filling the recreation room. Bingo cards covered every table, marked with splotches of bright ink where shaky hands had daubed numbers. The younger former officer, now answering to Grace without complaint, moved between tables with a fresh ink pad, helping residents whose arthritis made pressing the markers difficult. Number 42, called Miss Edna from her wheelchair at the caller's station. Her voice, though aged, carried the crisp diction of a former schoolteacher. At table 4, the older officer leaned down as Mr. Petrovsky tugged his sleeve. "This says B12, the elderly Russian man whispered loudly, but she say B9. Which is?" The officer studied the card, then pointed gently. "You misheard, sir. She definitely said B12. He didn't add that he'd been checking every called number against his own card, not to play, but to prevent exactly this confusion. Across the room, the judge stood observing near the refreshment table, arms crossed. His father joined him, handing over a styrofoam cup of weak coffee. "They're trying," the old man murmured. The judge watched as his former arresting officer patiently helped Mrs. Alvarez find her dropped glasses. "I see that." His voice held no warmth, but the edge had dulled. A sudden commotion erupted near the bingo caller. Miss Edna had slumped forward, her wrinkled hand slipping from the number cage. The older officer reached her first, easing her back in the wheelchair while the younger one scrambled for the emergency phone. "Diabetes," the old man said immediately, already moving toward the scene. "Her insulin must be." The judge's hand on his arm stopped him. "Let them handle it." And handle it they did. While the younger officer relayed clear instructions to the 911 operator, the older one, drawing on first responder training he hadn't used in years, checked Miss Edna's pulse and breathing. His hands, which had once gripped the old man's arm too tightly, now moved with practiced gentleness. By the time paramedics arrived, Miss Edna was conscious again, sipping orange juice through a straw as the older officer held the cup steady. Her gnarled fingers patted his wrist. "Good boy," she murmured, and something in the man's face shifted at those words. Later, as twilight painted the senior center windows gold, the old man found the older officer sitting alone on the patio bench, staring at his hands. "Miss Edna's going to be fine," the old man said, lowering himself carefully onto the bench. His knees popped audibly. The officer didn't look up. "I forgot the glucose protocol at first." Stood there like an idiot. The old man considered this. "But you remembered." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by distant traffic sounds and the rustle of oak leaves in the evening breeze. When the officer finally spoke, his voice was rough. "First week on patrol, my training officer told me these calls were a waste of time. That real cops didn't babysit seniors." He flexed his fingers. I believed him. The old man watched a sparrow land on the patio railing. "And now?" "Now I think." The officer exhaled sharply. "Now I think I forgot what the badge was supposed to mean." Inside, through the glass doors, laughter erupted as the younger officer attempted to teach line dancing to a group of wheelchair users, his own movements exaggeratedly slow to match their pace. The old man smiled. "Maybe you're remembering now." At the precinct, change was happening too. The judge's influence had prompted an internal review of all use of force complaints from the past 5 years. Overtime was cancelled for mandatory de-escalation training. Most strikingly, every officer now carried cards with the senior center's address and bus schedule, courtesy of the 2 former officers who'd become unlikely advocates for community policing. The police chief, reviewing the latest policy updates in his office, paused at a photograph on his desk, his own father, smiling in his retirement community. With a sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. "Pop? Yeah, it's me. Thought maybe I could take you to breakfast Saturday." Sunday morning found the old man and his son at their usual diner booth, syrup bottles between them as they divided the newspaper sections. The judge paused at a small article on page 6. Two former officers had volunteered to chaperone the senior center's upcoming trip to the botanical gardens. "Looks like your experiment is working," the judge remarked, passing the section to his father. The old man adjusted his reading glasses, hiding a smile. "Not an experiment. Just giving folks a chance to be their better selves." As the waitress refilled their coffee, the judge studied his father, the stubborn set of his shoulders, the quiet determination in his eyes that no amount of aging had dimmed. For the 100th time, he marveled at how this unassuming man could upend entire systems without ever raising his voice. "Next time," the judge said suddenly, "tell me sooner. When someone hurts you." The old man reached across the table, his spotted hand covering his son's. "Wasn't just about me, and you know it." Outside the diner window, the town went about its Sunday routines, families heading to church, joggers weaving through sidewalks, shopkeepers raising their awnings. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, each carrying the quiet hope that given the chance, they too might rise to meet their better selves. The botanical gardens buzzed with unusual activity that Saturday morning. 3 charter buses idled near the entrance, their doors wheezing open as senior center volunteers arranged walkers and wheelchairs on the pavement. The old man stood near the ticket booth, checking names off a clipboard with Sergeant Wilkins. His good jacket, the same one he'd worn to court, hung slightly loose on his frame, but his posture was straight as he greeted each arriving resident. Near the rose garden archway, the 2 former officers waited in matching volunteer polo shirts. The younger one, now sporting a neat haircut and clean-shaven cheeks, adjusted his sunglasses nervously. "What if someone falls? Or gets lost? There's so many." His older partner cut him off with a clap on the shoulder. "Then we help them. Like we've been doing." The confidence in his voice surprised them both. A commotion at the entrance announced Miss Edna's arrival. She rolled up in a wheelchair pushed by her granddaughter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Spotting her rescuers, she beckoned imperiously. "You two, come tell these youngsters how I like my chair positioned in the shade." As they hurried over, the old man exchanged amused glances with Sergeant Wilkins. The transformation in these men still astonished him sometimes, the way the younger one now instinctively offered his arm for balance without being asked, how the older one remembered which residents needed extra sunscreen. The judge arrived just as the group began moving toward the first exhibit. He fell into step beside his father, their familiar rhythm matching despite the difference in their gaits. "All this was your idea," he remarked quietly. The old man shook his head, watching as the former officers helped residents navigate the gravel paths. "Just gave them space to find their own way." In the butterfly pavilion, humidity wrapped around visitors like a warm blanket. The younger officer crouched beside Mr. Petrovsky's wheelchair, pointing out a vibrant blue morpho butterfly. "See how its wings look dull until the light hits just right?" The elderly man squinted. "Bah! In Ukraine we had butterflies big as your hand." But he leaned forward eagerly when a swallowtail landed on a nearby branch. Near the koi pond, the older officer found himself cornered by 3 white-haired women debating the best way to feed the fish. Miss Edna presided over the discussion like a judge, finally declaring, "Let the boy show us, he grew up on a farm." The officer blinked. He hadn't mentioned that to anyone at the center. Then he remembered, he'd told Miss Edna during her hospital recovery, when she demanded to know, what kind of upbringing produces a man who can't recognize hypoglycemia. Now, under the approving gaze of these grandmothers, he demonstrated the proper way to scatter pellets so every fish got some. It struck him suddenly, this was the first time in years civilians had looked at him with something other than fear or resentment. The realization left him oddly breathless. At lunchtime, Picnic tables beneath the oak trees became a bustling cafeteria. The judge found himself handing out napkins and opening stubborn pudding cups, his usual courtroom dignity forgotten as Mrs. Kowalski lectured him on proper sandwich cutting techniques. Diagonal cuts, she insisted, demonstrating with shaky hands. Otherwise the crusts are too tough for dentures. The judge nodded solemnly. I'll remember that, ma'am. Nearby, his father sat contentedly with a plate of potato salad, listening to Sergeant Wilkins recount some long-ago police academy mishap. The old man's laughter drew glances from their table, residents who remembered his quiet sadness after the arrest now seeing how brightly he shone when surrounded by people he loved. The younger officer approached hesitantly, holding 2 cups of lemonade. Thought you might be thirsty, he said, offering one to the old man. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and for a moment, both remembered a different touch, the harsh grip of an arrest that now felt like it happened to different people in another lifetime. Thank you, the old man said, and meant it in more ways than one. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the group gathered for a photo by the fountain. Residents arranged themselves carefully, walkers parked out of frame, hearing aids adjusted so they wouldn't glint in the sun. The younger officer surprised everyone by producing a professional-looking camera from his bag. Photography minor in college, he explained sheepishly when eyebrows raised. He directed the group with unexpected skill, adjusting angles until every face was visible. Judge, maybe stand next to your dad? And Mrs. Kowalski, your hat is gorgeous, let's make sure it shows. When the camera finally clicked, it captured something remarkable. Not just smiling faces, but a genuine togetherness. The older officer's arm around Mr. Petrovsky's shoulders. Miss Edna patting the judge's hand like he was her own grandson. The old man glowing at the center of it all, his son's protective presence beside him. On the bus ride back, the old man dozed against the window, exhausted but happy. The judge watched over him, remembering countless childhood moments when their positions had been reversed, his father staying up through the night during his fevers, driving him to college interviews, sitting proudly in the front row at his law school graduation. At the senior center parking lot, goodbyes took nearly an hour as residents insisted on thanking each volunteer personally. The younger officer received so many cheek pinches he looked like he'd developed a rash. As the crowd dispersed, the older officer approached the judge. Sir, he stopped, started again. I applied to nursing school. Geriatric specialty. The judge studied him, the new calm in his eyes, the way he automatically positioned himself to block the wind for a passing walker. You'll be good at that, he said finally. It wasn't forgiveness. Not exactly. But it was a beginning. That evening, the old man sat on his porch swing, the day's warmth still lingering in the wooden slats beneath him. The judge joined him, handing over a mug of chamomile tea exactly how his father liked it, 2 sugars, no spoon left in. They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies blink awake in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down the street, children laughed at a game only they understood. The old man sighed contentedly. Good day. The judge nodded, sipping his own tea. Good day. And it was. Not perfect. Not magical. But good in the way that matters most, where broken things mend stronger at the cracks, where people surprise you by rising to meet their better selves, where an old man's quiet dignity can topple arrogance without ever raising his voice. The porch light flicked on, casting their shadows long across the lawn, 2 figures side by side, their shared silhouette looking for all the world like a single unbreakable shape.